earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too...
For 50 years, he said nothing. Not a word to journalists, not a whisper to documentary filmmakers, not even a confession to his own children. And when I asked him why he finally decided to talk, the answer sent a chill down my spine. He leaned back in his chair, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Because everyone who could hurt me is finally in the ground." The man sitting across from me is 82 years old. His hand shakes slightly when he reaches for his coffee, but his mind is sharp as a razor blade. He spent 31 years inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and for a significant portion of that career, his job involved something most Americans never knew existed. He monitored high-profile targets, not criminals in the traditional sense, not foreign spies or domestic terrorists. He watched celebrities, public figures, cultural icons whose influence had grown so massive that the government considered them potential threats to national stability. And at the top of that list, for reasons that will become horrifyingly clear, was Elvis Aaron Presley. Now, before you dismiss this as conspiracy nonsense, understand something important. The FBI's surveillance of Elvis Presley is not speculation. It is documented fact. His file, partially declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, runs over 500 pages. The Bureau tracked his movements. They monitored his associations. They intercepted his communications. What has never been explained, however, is why. Why would the most powerful law enforcement agency in America dedicate those kinds of resources to a man who sang love songs and swiveled his hips? The official explanation has always been vague. Concerns about his influence on youth, worries about his connections to controversial figures, generic bureaucratic justifications that never quite added up. The analyst I spoke with says the real reason was something else entirely, something that has been deliberately obscured for 5 decades, and it starts with a single devastating observation. Elvis Presley went quiet in his final years. Everyone knows this. The public narrative frames it as decline, depression, drug addiction. A man who had everything slowly losing his grip on reality, but the analyst sees it differently. He says Elvis didn't lose his voice. He says Elvis made a calculated decision to stop using it. There is a profound difference between a man who cannot speak and a man who chooses silence because speaking would destroy him. According to the analyst, Elvis was the latter, and the Bureau knew it. Think about what that means for a moment. The most famous entertainer on the planet, a man who could command stadiums full of screaming fans, a man whose every word was treated as gospel by millions of devoted followers, suddenly retreats into isolation. He cancels appearances, he avoids interviews, he surrounds himself with armed guards, and locks himself inside Graceland like a man preparing for siege. The world assumed he was falling apart. The analyst says he was holding himself together by a thread because he understood something terrifying. He understood that the moment he opened his mouth about what he knew, his life would be measured in hours. What did he know? That question haunted me throughout our conversation. The analyst was careful about details. 50 years of bureau training does not disappear overnight, and even now, with most of the key players dead, he chose his words with surgical precision. But what he did reveal paints a picture of Elvis Presley that bears almost no resemblance to the man we think we knew. The king of rock and roll was not just a musician. By the early 1970s, through a series of circumstances that were partly ambition and partly terrible luck, Elvis had gained access to rooms he was never supposed to enter. He had heard conversations that were never meant for civilian ears. He had witnessed arrangements between powerful men that, if exposed, would have detonated like a bomb in the center of American political life. And the people involved knew he had witnessed them. The analyst described Elvis in those final years as a man living inside a prison of his own fame. He could not disappear. He was too recognizable, too beloved, too constantly watched by the public eye. But he also could not speak. The walls were closing in from both directions, and the only survival strategy available was silence. Absolute, total, suffocating silence. And here is where it gets darker. Because isolation was not enough. The people who feared what Elvis knew did not trust his quiet. They needed assurance. They needed control. And according to the Analyst, they got it by placing their own people inside Elvis's inner circle. The men Elvis trusted most, the ones he called his brothers, the ones who swore they would protect him with their lives, at least 2 of them were reporting back. Elvis was not surrounded by loyalty, he was surrounded by surveillance. And he spent his final years as a prisoner in his own home, watched by the very men he believed were keeping him safe. Now, stop. Let that sink in. Because what the Analyst revealed next explains why Elvis spent those final years armed to the teeth, paranoid beyond reason, unable to sleep without medication. He was not fighting imaginary demons, he was fighting real ones. And they were standing right beside him, smiling, waiting for him to make one wrong move. December 21st, 1970. The photograph is iconic. Elvis Presley standing in the Oval Office, shaking hands with President Richard Nixon, both men smiling like old friends. The official story has always played it for laughs. A drugged-out rock star, high on his own legend, waltzing into the White House to request a federal narcotics badge. Nixon, amused by the absurdity, playing along for the photo opportunity. 2 men from completely different worlds sharing a bizarre moment that meant nothing beyond its surface strangeness. The Analyst says that interpretation is not just wrong. It is deliberately misleading. That meeting was not a joke. That meeting was the beginning of everything that would eventually destroy Elvis Presley. What most people do not realize is that Elvis did not simply ask for a badge that day. He asked for access. He wanted credentials that would allow him to move through certain circles without suspicion. He wanted the authority to gather information on drug trafficking networks he believed were corrupting American youth. Whether his motivations were genuine patriotism or something more complicated, the Analyst could not say. What he could say was that Nixon, desperate for cultural allies during the Vietnam era, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He gave Elvis exactly what he asked for. Not a ceremonial badge, not a symbolic gesture, real credentials. Documents that opened doors Elvis Presley had no business walking through. And walk through them he did. Between 1970 and 1973, Elvis attended gatherings that existed far outside the world of entertainment. Private functions where government officials mingled with businessmen whose backgrounds did not bear close examination. Quiet meetings in rooms where conversations happened that were never meant to be overheard by anyone outside a very specific circle. Elvis was there because his credentials allowed him to be there. He was tolerated because his fame made him seem harmless. Who would suspect the king of rock and roll of understanding what he was hearing? But Elvis understood. Maybe not everything. Maybe not immediately. But over time, the pieces began forming a picture that should have terrified him. Names connected to names. Operations mentioned in passing that linked government agencies to figures in organized crime. Financial arrangements that flowed through channels designed to remain invisible. Elvis heard conversations about deals that would have ended careers, destroyed reputations, and potentially brought down men at the highest levels of American power. The Analyst described it as accidental espionage. Elvis was not trying to gather intelligence. He was simply present in rooms where intelligence existed. But presence was enough. Memory was enough. And Elvis Presley, whatever his other flaws, had an extraordinary memory. By 1974, the Bureau had upgraded their classification of Elvis from curiosity to concern. Internal documents, which the Analyst claims to have personally reviewed, described him as a passive liability. The terminology was precise. A passive liability was someone who possessed dangerous knowledge but had not yet demonstrated intent to use it. The key word was yet, because the Bureau understood something fundamental about information. It does not remain passive forever. Eventually, it finds a way out. And then Elvis made his fatal mistake. He started recording, not music, conversations. According to the Analyst, Elvis began keeping audio documentation of certain interactions. Insurance, he called it. Protection against the day when someone might decide his knowledge had become too dangerous. He believed that possessing evidence would keep him safe. If anything happened to him, the recordings would surface. Mutually assured destruction. A deadlock that would protect him indefinitely. He was wrong. Catastrophically, tragically wrong. Because the moment Elvis started building his insurance policy, he transformed himself from a passive liability into an active threat, and active threats demanded active responses. The Analyst paused at this point in our conversation. His eyes grew distant, like a man watching something painful replay in his memory. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. He said that Elvis never understood the world he had stumbled into. He thought evidence equaled safety. He thought powerful men played by rules. He thought his fame would shield him from consequences. But someone found out about the recordings, and the people Elvis trusted to protect him were the ones who made the phone call. Everyone remembers the decline, the bloated figure in the white jumpsuit, sweating through performances that once electrified nations, the canceled tours, the reclusiveness, the endless prescriptions. History has written Elvis Presley's final chapter as a cautionary tale about fame and excess, a brilliant man who drowned in his own appetites. But the Analyst who sat across from me painted a portrait so different, so heartbreaking, that it fundamentally changes everything we think we know about those last years. Elvis did not retreat from the world because he was falling apart. He retreated because staying visible meant staying vulnerable. Every public appearance was a risk. Every interview was a potential trap. Every moment in the spotlight reminded dangerous people that he still existed, still possessed what he possessed, still represented a threat that had not been neutralized. Graceland was not a palace of excess. It was a fortress. And Elvis was not its king. He was its prisoner. The Analyst explained the behavioral shifts that everyone misinterpreted. Elvis surrounded himself with firearms because he genuinely believed someone might come for him. He installed security systems that would have seemed paranoid for a head of state, let alone an entertainer. He stopped trusting new people entirely, cycling through the same small group of associates who had been with him for years. But here is the cruel irony that makes this story unbearable. The people he trusted most, the Memphis Mafia, who swore their loyalty was unbreakable, at least two of them had been compromised. The Analyst could not confirm whether they were directly employed by government agencies or simply connected to the networks Elvis had accidentally exposed. The distinction, he said, did not matter. What mattered was that information flowed out of Graceland with disturbing regularity. Elvis's movements, his mental state, his occasional drunken comments about what he knew and what he might someday reveal. Everything was reported. Everything was cataloged. Elvis thought he was surrounded by brothers. He was surrounded by surveillance wearing familiar faces. And the prescriptions. God, the prescriptions. The public has always assumed Elvis was an addict who lost control, a man chasing highs until the highs consumed him. The Analyst sees it differently. He believes Elvis was self-medicating against terror. Imagine living every single day knowing that powerful men wanted you silent. Imagine understanding that your closest friends might be your greatest enemies. Imagine lying awake at night, listening for footsteps, wondering if tonight was the night someone decided the risk had grown too great. That kind of fear does not produce insomnia. It produces psychological destruction. The pills were not about pleasure. They were about survival. They were the only thing standing between Elvis and complete mental collapse. The Analyst told me something that has haunted me since the moment I heard it. In 1976, approximately 1 year before his death, Elvis confided in someone he believed he could trust. He said he had enough on tape to bring down half of Washington. Those were his exact words. Enough to bring down half of Washington. Whether that was exaggeration or literal truth, the Analyst could not say. But what he could confirm was that the person Elvis confided in reported that statement within 48 hours. The information went up a chain that ended in rooms Elvis himself had once been foolish enough to enter. After that conversation, Elvis's prescription intake increased dramatically. His isolation deepened. His paranoia, which everyone dismissed as drug-induced delusion, intensified beyond anything he had previously displayed. The Analyst believes this was not coincidence. He believes Elvis understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that his insurance policy had failed. The recordings that were supposed to protect him had instead painted a target on his back. The people who wanted him silent now knew exactly how dangerous his silence actually was. Elvis Presley did not fade away in those final months. He was being suffocated, slowly, deliberately, by people who smiled at him, who laughed at his jokes, who called him friend and brother, while methodically tightening the grip around his throat. He could not escape. He could not fight back. He could only wait, medicated into numbness, hoping that his silence would be enough to buy him another day. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. So why now? That question burned in my mind throughout every moment of our conversation. This man had carried these secrets for half a century. He had watched documentaries that told the wrong story. He had read books that painted Elvis as a self-destructive cautionary tale. He had seen the truth buried under layers of convenient narrative, and he had said nothing. For 50 years, absolute silence. So what changed? The Analyst leaned forward when I asked him directly. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and what he said explained everything. He told me that for decades speaking would have been suicide. Not metaphorical suicide, not career suicide, actual death. The people involved had long memories and longer reach. They had demonstrated repeatedly what happened to individuals who talked out of turn. He had watched colleagues who asked too many questions find themselves reassigned to career-ending posts. He had seen men who pushed too hard suffer accidents that were never investigated. He had understood, with the clarity that only comes from witnessing consequences firsthand, that survival meant keeping his mouth shut. But time changes everything. The men who made those decisions are gone now. The networks that enforce silence have crumbled. The power structures that once seemed invincible have been replaced by new power structures with different priorities. The Analyst is 82 years old. His children are grown. His wife passed 3 years ago. He has nothing left to protect except the truth, and he has decided that the truth deserves to finally breathe. What he revealed about the aftermath of Elvis's death confirms the darkest suspicions anyone has ever harbored about that August morning in 1977. Elvis was found unresponsive in his Graceland bathroom. The official response was swift, perhaps too swift. Within hours, before any proper investigation could be conducted, the cause of death was attributed to cardiac arrhythmia. Case closed. No questions asked. No deeper examination required. A 42-year-old man with no history of heart disease simply dropped dead, and the medical establishment accepted this explanation without hesitation. The Analyst says the speed was not coincidental, it was coordinated. People who needed this story to end quickly made certain it ended quickly. The investigation that should have happened was strangled in its crib, and anyone who raised objections found their concerns dismissed as conspiracy thinking. But the real operation happened inside Graceland itself. The Analyst believes that within hours of Elvis's death, before the body was even cold, people entered that house who had no business being there. They were not mourners. They were not family. They were professionals conducting a specific mission. The recordings Elvis had accumulated Over years of careful paranoia, the insurance policy he believed would protect him forever vanished completely. Tapes that should have existed were never found. Documents that Elvis had referenced in conversations simply disappeared. Grassland was not just mourned that day, it was sanitized. And here is what makes this truly unforgivable. The prescriptions that flooded Elvis's system in those final months did not appear by accident. Someone ensured he had access to whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. The very drugs that were slowly killing him flowed through channels that could have been disrupted at any moment. They were not disrupted. They were enabled. The Analyst believes this was not neglect. It was strategy. Keep Elvis medicated enough to remain passive. Keep him isolated enough to remain invisible. Keep him drowning slowly so that when the end finally came, it would look like exactly what everyone expected. Another celebrity who could not handle fame. Another tragic waste. Another story with a convenient ending that required no further questions. Elvis Presley was not murdered in the traditional sense. No one held a gun to his head. No one slipped poison into his drink. The operation was far more elegant than that. He was managed into oblivion, surrounded by handlers who reported his every word, supplied with chemicals that accelerated his deterioration, isolated from anyone who might have helped him fight back. And when the combined weight of fear and drugs and loneliness finally crushed him, the people responsible simply stepped back and let nature take its course. The world remembers Elvis as a cautionary tale. The Analyst believes he should be remembered as something else entirely. A man who stumbled into darkness he never understood. A man who tried to protect himself with evidence that only made him more dangerous. A man who chose silence because silence was the only weapon he had left. And a man whose silence, in the end, could not save him from people who had already decided he knew too much. The king did not leave the building voluntarily. He was shown the door by men whose names we will never know, whose faces never appeared in photographs, whose fingerprints were carefully wiped from every surface. And for 50 years, they have slept peacefully, confident that their secrets died with him, until now. If this story changed how you see Elvis Presley, you are not alone. The truth has been waiting 50 years for someone to listen. Subscribe to this channel because we are just getting started. More revelations are coming. Like this video and share it with someone who deserves to know what really happened to the king.